Okay, so I think I may have too many slides and too much stuff. So please feel free to interrupt, or if we get bad on time, Ollie, just say so. I don't need to say everything, but
No.
off we go. And so we referred a little bit to this earlier in the day. Um, American politics is generally divided into institutions people and behavior people. And I really should have Jason Pearson in here as an institutions person too, because the courts are considered a lot of that has to do with rules, norms, and incentives of the court itself and the people working within it. And then there's what we call behavior, um, which is stuff like attitudes, preferences of people in general. So if you're interested in kind of the average American, you're probably more interested in behavior. And that's also where Dr. Skinner does most of her work. So and the thing that's strange about American political behavior is so many people don't pay much attention. So you always got to think about several different um, levels of engagement at the same time. There's some people that are really into it, and the other thing we know is that American public ignores politics a ton or actively avoids it. Um, but there are even with that, there are patterns in the way emotions and irrationality, obviously vote choice and election stuff at the individual level is a behavior topic. So that's where I am. I'm what they call mass. I don't like these terms. I think they feel kind of icky, but we will divide it into mass and elite. So elite being like elected officials and whatnot, and mass being regular people. And I'm a mass behavior person. All right. So what we read for today, notice how the word social identity came up in all of the titles. I was trying to show how um, one theoretical point of view or one theoretical framework carries through these three works that we're going to talk about. So I'm going to dig right in. And I'll tell you a little bit about where this came from. So what I'm going to talk about in the Transue article is what got me interested in the topic, which had to do with the limitations of our existing ways of measuring racial equality and support for racial equality and in mass opinion. We'll talk about social identity theory, the empirical tests, and then some of the implications. And then you'll see the social identity theory is going to carry over into the Petro article and the Lewandowski article. So one of my frustrations when I was in graduate school was that I don't think, and this unfortunately is surprisingly still the case, we don't have really good items in our surveys to ask about racial equality. We ask about policies that are designed to bring that about. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't be asking about those policy items, but you think about it's like aid to cities, affirmative action, equal treatment, and then more recently, a lot of symbolic stuff about what symbols shouldn't be part of our discourse and things like that. And those are all very important. Don't get me wrong; they're important to know about. But let's say we woke up tomorrow and all those items are at the top of their scale. All of a sudden, everybody supports affirmative action, wants to fund the heck out of the EEOC, but all those are kind of aid and protection towards African Americans, and that's not really what we're after. If you think about it, in terms of what would racial equality look like, I mean, this last point is the most important one. I think that Black leaders should be viewed as potential stewards of the public trust rather than as a special interest. And let me say, I did all this. I mean, you saw it came out in 2007. I think we gathered these data in 1998. So this is well before Barack Obama, was a possibility. But it ought to be something like other groups. So, the history of, like, let's take the Irish in America. They, when they came over in large numbers, there are all these, ads we can still find in old newspapers that said no Irish need apply. There were all these essays written about how they were incompatible with democracy. There were riots, anti-Irish riots. If you watch The Simpsons, there's they have a good kind of sub-theme about memories of this. And it was something that people pounded each other in electoral politics, was not being tough enough on the Irish. So, and that's all gone away. I mean, people are sort of aware of Irish stuff, of Irish people, but if anything, it's become kind of this charming part of the American experience. So, and that also, let me pop over and see if this was, yeah. The other thing about that I feel that tells us is that there's a lot of work on stereotypes and trying to get people to see each other as individuals rather than as members of groups. And I think that a lot of that very cognitive stuff about stereotypes and perceptions is not actually the most fruitful way. I think what really matters is who's in and who's out, who's one of us. So that's why it's called the power of we. So, like, the stereotypes of the Irish are still around. I'm not going to talk about them, but some people have called St. Patrick's Day the reinforcement of the stereotypes, right? And stuff about drinking and size of family, all kinds of things. So they're there, but it's not like when talking about speakers of the House, like Paul Ryan, this didn't come up when he was Speaker of the House, right? It's not a card that you can play anymore with that group. So that's what it seems to me we ought to be. So what we need are items to figure out, how are we doing on that? So is it, no big deal? And back when I was working on this, we did have a question that we often asked that said, if your party nominated a qualified individual for president, would you vote for them? And that had gone up into the 80-90% people approving it. So in the abstract, you might think we're already there, but again, kind of like the tolerance literature, where it's when you're faced with something real, I want to see if we should be figuring out what is a real moment where it just isn't that big a deal. And again, like just one more example, somewhat related, but there's work on Catholicism and JFK, and there was some discussion when JFK was running about what Catholicism meant, that he'd be the first Catholic president, but that's gone. I mean, people are still aware of these things, but it's just doesn't have the same bite when they're considered part of the club. All right. So I thought that one of the things I said is I'm not going to do a purely cognitive thing. There's got to be some kind of visceral. I really think this is something that's visceral and that we need to work on. And also the fact that these groups have changed their status is something we should look at closely. So, super quick, social identity theory. There's a lot to say about it, but the beginning of it was with what we call the minimal in-group paradigm. there was a guy, there were a few people who were trying to figure out, why do people conflict with each other? And what they wanted to figure out was, what is the minimal amount of conflict or resource competition that leads people to perceive group boundaries? So what makes people divide the world into them and us? And they were going to figure out what is the lowest possible stakes. And it turns out there is no bottom. No, you tell people you tell people they've been randomly assigned to two different groups, and then ask them to allocate the reward money for doing this psych experiment, and they'll favor their in-group. These people who they've never seen before. I mean, this is replicated over and over and over in all kinds of cultures. We are just wired to think about things in terms of in-groups and out-groups. But that doesn't mean that we only get one set. One of the other things about social identity theory is that it's very situational. So we can there are things that we can think about that'll make subgroups more salient or make broader identifications more salient. So this distinction between subgroups and superordinate. I'm sorry that superordinate is such a pain, but when you're doing research, you can either pretend that you've made up something completely new. You can give a name that you like better to something that's already there, or you can use the name that already exists. And I'm pretty committed to trying to make science cumulative, so I continue to use things even if I don't love them. I just think I wish that word were like broader or something like that. But over and over, we see that we can perceive things in terms of subgroup identities or superordinate identities, and these can move back and forth as to what we're paying attention to. So this is a great literature. I mean, there's stuff not only in political science, there's stuff about in business where they've looked at mergers and found that renaming when two companies merge, coming up with a new name can reduce conflict by quite a bit, as opposed to it being like two subgroups, the one who was taken over and the one that took over the other. So superordinate identities are anything that goes across. So even within the group of us now, we could emphasize subgroup identities, me and Ali as faculty and the rest of you as students. We could emphasize the states that we're from, right? Ali and I could go on and on about Illinois, and the other people in Illinois could talk about it, and then that would make an Illinois subgroup, and other states would be subordinate. Or we could talk about all the interesting stuff that's happening to people without bachelor's degrees. That this group is moving around electorally, and there's this deaths of despair stuff where there's the life expectancy is going down. Then we'd all be sharing. Then we're the educated ones, and we're interested to know more about this other group. So it's flexible, and what you want to think about it is in terms of not this all the time, but this is the mapping from subgroups to American national identity for what I was interested in. But the reason why I keep talking about salience is that, and this is another thing that's deeply validated in psychology, is we can only pay attention to so many things at a time. So if we're thinking about subgroups, the shared identity becomes less salient. You don't think about things in that way. So if we wanted to, what you see on the screen now is if we wanted to make subgroup identity salient, like those boundaries would become really apparent, and the dotted line is there because there is still a shared identity, but it doesn't catch your eye as much. On the other hand, if you want to try and put people in to emphasizing their superordinate identity, then what, by drawing attention to that broader shared identity, it draws attention away from the others. You can think about it. Yeah, just we have limited attention. So this was all pretty well established in psychology, and they'd done tons of lab work with social identity, and then also some real world, not a ton at the time. And this struck me as one of the solutions to what I was puzzling about earlier, is that emphasizing the superordinate identity, American national identity, could that be something that would draw people's attention away from these subgroup squabbles? I shouldn't call them squabbles. There's some real stuff. So what we did was a survey experiment. It was called the Minnesota Multi-Investigator Study. That's the MMIS. And it was an experiment within a random sample. So it's what we call a survey experiment. And I was comparing the social identity predictions to a yet older set of theory called policy particularism that I'll touch on briefly. And then the dependent variable. So one of the criticisms of psych stuff in general, and especially lab studies, is that you can get people to do things by priming them, but it doesn't really matter. Psychology experiments are so low stakes because you might never see those people again, and it's not a huge amount of money, and IRB makes sure that you don't harm anybody, which is a good thing. But they're all kind of low stakes, low impact. And the dependent variable in this study was asking people about taxes for schools, which, again, it's just talk. I admit that, but it's stuff that people have strong opinions about. Okay. So there had been a previous set of work that argued that one of the things that made these racial policy preferences less popular than be otherwise is because the beneficiaries were a smaller group. So this way of thinking says it's not anything about race, it's the particularism of the policy. So more people like Social Security than like aid to cities, because everybody might get Social Security eventually, but only people in cities are going to benefit from aid to cities directly. So they also did a survey experiment. This is a guy named Paul Snyderman. And there was a preamble, and so some people said taxes need to be raised to take care of pressing national needs. And then the respondents are randomly assigned to get either what he called a race neutral. How willing would you be to have your taxes raised to improve education in public schools? Or the more specific, improve educational opportunities for minorities. And what they found, which was in a book called Reaching Beyond Race, is that race neutral wording got 65% support, and the race specific wording got 46% support. By the way, thinking back to that info cycle and about how slow peer-reviewed research is. So Reaching Beyond Race came out in 97. My response to it came out in 2007. And then Lewandowski's building on it came out in 2017, 2018. So it's 10 years each step of the way. It doesn't have to be that way, but it often ends up being that way. In any case, so what I want to do, so my idea is I have a different view of the mechanism. I said, well, I understand what you're saying, Paul Snyderman, about this specific versus broad, but also by saying minorities and by not saying anything about groups, you set up a subgroup, basically. I mean, you put people in the frame of mind to think about their benefits going elsewhere. So I was interested, what if we pitted a social identity treatment against that particularism treatment? So this was a survey with a lot of other people. I think I had 3 questions on something that had that took, I'm not sure how long our respondents went for, but I just had a few questions, and I didn't want to hit them over the head with things and you know, ruin it for the other people in the survey. So I wanted something kind of unobtrusive. So these are the people were randomly assigned to get asked either how close do you feel to your racial or ethnic group, and with the idea that that would make subgroup identities more salient, or half of them were asked how close do you feel to other Americans, and you could say very close, somewhat close, not very close, or not at all close. So it combined these. So first they got randomly assigned to either that subgroup or the superordinate one. That's what you see in the first branch there. And then each of those groups got randomly assigned to either the particular or the broad wording. As an aside, this was originally in the article. I think this really lets you see the experiment flow, but they would not let me keep it in for space reasons. So I get to show it to you, and I really wish they had kept it in. It still bothers me. I think it would have made it much more understandable. Anyway, water under the bridge. So drawing straight out of social identity theory, which I'm just barely skimming the surface of it in this talk. One of the things that's very interesting about it is that what we think is going on there, the psychological mechanism, is that people draw some self-esteem from their group identities. So if you're a group, so there's a lot of stuff we could say about that, but we believe that the mechanism of the superordinate stuff is that it's not just, do you like this group? It's identity. Do you feel close to them? So they go from being another team or people that you're indifferent to being part of the self, right? You've implicated the self. And we find in the laboratory experiments that it often leads people to want to, they want the whole group to do well. So if this is right, then it's not like a zero-sum game. We can make it like by this reframing of what aid to public schools or aid to minority education is, it's strengthening the whole team, right? So, and we have empirical predictions of what that would look like. So we could, well, I'll get to it when we get to it, but hold that in your mind as we go. So we've talked about how articles go on and on and on, and they seem to say the same thing over and over. And that's true of this one too. And some of that is because of, and I've said this before, is the search for robustness, trying to demonstrate that what I've got here is something really about how people react to this information or how people behave. And it's not just a fluke of what I did. So if you just go by which identity condition they were assigned to, these are the means that you get. So the least, so that 46 there is saying that 46% of the people supported having their taxes raised for minority opportunity when they had been given the ethnic group prime. People who were in the ethnic group prime but got the public schools wording were higher at 50, although not significantly higher. And the other Americans wording. So what we got here, we have a significant difference between that 0.46 and that 0.57, which is expected, but it's expected by both perspectives. So that's not helping us sort out between the policy particularism and the identity based. So And there's a passage in the article you may have read where I compared an experimental treatment, this question, is a treatment not working, to being like if you were given a diet and you ended up doing the opposite. So, and then if your health did not improve, is that the diet's fault or because of what you did? So to try and get in on this table restricts just to people who said they felt somewhat or very close to the identity they had been offered, right? So there's other people who are rejecting those identities, and I'm not exactly sure what to think about them. So now we're just doing these. And here we get more of the pattern that I was expecting. So in that ethnic group condition, when subgroups are salient, that minority opportunity in public schools wording made a significant difference. Then for people who got over on the right hand there, the other Americans identity prime, they're higher. They have higher support across the board, right? Which goes with this idea of bringing others into the self. And the gap between the two, so that minority opportunity versus public schools, people didn't see that as informative, right? Because, and I would argue that's because they're seeing them all in the same team. All right. So that's one way to do it. A more rigorous way is to model that as a three-way interaction. And we don't have to go into this much. I'm going to, well, and in the article, I show the results of the model. But what's important is, for me, is this three-way interaction. What is this? There's a brand new toolbar. I just want to draw. Oh, here we go. So I'm not going to get into a whole thing about reading regression tables, but one thing that you'll hear over and over is this idea of statistical significance. So here at the bottom, it says that 2 or 3 stars mean it's significant at 5% or 1%. What that is that's the chance that this pattern in the data is just a fluke, right? That it's not actually something that's happening to the people. It's just some sort of random sampling or a fluke of the measurement. And as you can see, these are all 3 significant. And these are 3 different models. Here's the one is just the experimental stuff. 2 is controlling for a lot of stuff that we think would influence that decision. And 3 is trimming that down just to the significant predictors. But they all tell the same story. What's important is not to focus on these 3 models, but to say that they're all telling us the same thing, that identity, particularism, and acceptance of that identity together is affecting people's variation on this tax question. All right. So here's the results in the end. If we just look at the people who, so these are predicted values based on that, on table, on model 3 from that table we just saw. When you prime people to think about their subgroups, we get that school tax experiment result almost exactly. It's kind of spooky. It overjoys me. Where we got 0.64 supporting it in the public schools wording, and we have 0.5 supporting it in the minority opportunity wording. But when people got this superordinate prime ahead of time, when they were thinking that they felt very or somewhat close to other Americans, that public schools wording actually stays the same, but the minority opportunity comes up quite a bit, from 0.5 to 0.61. And now there's no difference, there's no significant difference between that public schools. So it appears that it's not just the breadth, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but it's the relationship between the people who are being asked to pay the tax and where it's going to go. And if it's my subgroup is going to pay for some other subgroup, people don't support that as much. If it's my group to other members of my group, there's more support. And this and just mentioning minorities doesn't break that, right? So subordinate identity, at least in this experiment, seems to be more powerful than that potentially divisive way of framing it. So yeah, you round up 0.65, 0.46, you'd round that up to 0.5. Spooky. Anyway, so what we got from this, I believe, is replication of policy particularism. So I did show that again in a completely different set of data. I don't know when the school tax experiment was done, but it was well before 1998. So this is part of why I'm obsessed with this idea of cumulative science. So I showed that what had been done before came out again. But then I showed that I had something that was stronger. This is trumped in the bridge sense, or euchre, or card game sense, where anything of this suit is stronger than whatever your card is in the other. And it could have been that it flattened things out by reducing support for both, right? That would have been a possible outcome, but that's not what happened. It seems to have gotten people out of this zero-sum thinking where whatever goes to somebody is coming away from me, and says that we need to talk about things in terms of the perceived relationship between respondents and beneficiaries. So I think, and then for the psych folks, there was some stuff that was an early thing using social identity theory just out in the wild. Just this was a phone survey, so calling people in their homes. So the questions as treatments, I think that it was useful. Some people have adopted that, and some people think that I kind of lost random assignment by doing that step. And so that's a fair critique. But the other thing that's nice about this is instead of it being lab identities that are made up, it's pre-existing identities that and we were able to change the salience of things that will still be with them afterwards. All right. So one of the most important things about this, it's going to travel over to this. So that's it for that paper. We can ask questions about it if you want. Otherwise, I'm going to go on to these other two and we can ask them out at the end. But I'm kind of interested in the connections among the three. But the most important thing in some ways is this idea that intergroup relations are two dimensions. So you can think of it as one dimension would be it's just I like him or I don't like him. And what this is showing you is that we can like our own group, our in-groups more or less. Some people who are really into their in-group identities. Like I said, I went to University of Michigan. I went to some football games, but I like them, and I am proud to have gone to Michigan. But I know people who didn't go to Michigan who have so much Michigan stuff, and how Michigan does on a Saturday, that determines the rest of their weekend, right? So they've got much more in-group affection to the football team than I do, right? And so you could vary on that. That's its own thing. Then there's out-group affection. So if we want to continue with the football metaphor, some people hate Ohio State. That's our big rival. Some people, it doesn't matter. Back when the Big Ten meant something, I would root for other Big Ten teams just because it was like rooting for the Midwest and other things. Anyway, so this is the insight. I would say it's an insight that it's a finding, that it's real, that these are separate dimensions. So you can simultaneously like your in-group and an out-group. You can simultaneously be alienated from both and just not care about them. And then there's the kind of classic, then there is the possibility for people to be high in in-group affection and very low in out-group affection. But that's not everybody. We've got people end up in all of these quadrants. It's more like, in your car, there's the gas and there's the brake. And yes, they're both influencing the same thing, but they are separate dimensions in some ways. All right. So took that same framework. That last paper, I consider my happy paper. This paper is the depressing paper. And it took me forever to get this thing published, partially because I did not really enjoy working on it. But you gotta report what you know. So this was now post Obama. And after Barack Obama was elected, we saw an increase in a construct called racial resentment, which is basically outgroup dislike from whites towards other racial groups. So in particular, there was this book by a guy named Michael Tesler, Post-Racial or Most Racial. And one of the things that he found is that this racial resentment scale, which always has been influential, but it was mostly influential on the policies that were relevant to race. It started, he talked about other elements of our political system or discourse being racialized. So all of a sudden, the racial resentment scale was a big predictor of presidential vote choice in a way that it hadn't been before. So my co-authors and I looked at that and we said, well, racial resentment's the out-group dimension. I wonder if anything's happening on the in-group dimension. And and people had thought about looking at closeness to whites. I mean, that's something that's been on the ANES, which is our flagship survey. But it never made that much difference. So we were just kind of doing the same thing. So this, we talk about a conversation. So Tesler found that this thing that we've been studying for a long time started to matter in a different way. And then we drew something that we were more familiar with and said, let's check if that was. So there, in some ways, this paper is in dialogue with the other one. Let me show you the racial resentment scale. It's not the most pleasant scale, but what we're trying to get here, it is, this is a measurement device. And what we want to be able to do is distinguish people who are more and less resentful towards African Americans. And these are things you can hear people say, right? It's certainly on talk radio. This is not outside of the bounds. And it's another thing that's kind of good about it is it's a multi-item scale, which has good properties. The items are not all worded in the same direction, because sometimes when people stop paying attention on surveys, they just start saying yes to everything. And you can get this bizarre confound where they look really high in a trait you were measuring because they said yes to everything, but they're really just saying yes because they wanted it to be over. So we try to counterbalance scales when we want valid scales of things. So saying yes, if you say yes the whole way through, you end up in the middle. And what we're after on a scale like this is just to be able to distinguish people from each other. So we don't want there's no point in asking from a scientific point of view something that everybody's going to say yes to or everybody's going to say no to. So we were trying to get stuff that would divide people. So, this is on a Likert scale. So each of these has 5 possible responses, from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So you get a lot of variation out of this. All right, so that's what the racial resentment scale. So you're going to see that throughout. And what we mean by high racial resentment is people, more agreeing with the first one, more disagreeing with the second one, agreeing with the third one, and disagreeing with the fourth one. All right, so one of Tesler's examples is this question: healthcare should be voluntarily left up to individuals. So, Harry Truman made an attempt to have a single payer healthcare system. So we've been asking about this for a long time. It's been on, as most of our peer nations do not, most of the developed world does not leave healthcare just up to individuals. But it's a live issue in American politics. So you can see the solid line here, December, it was asked in December of 2007. If you compare people who are at the very bottom, the least racial resentment, the least racially resentful, to the most, there is a gradient. So there is more, and this goes along with what had already begun happening with the party system at that point. But November 2009, it's really steep. And particularly, we're always interested when something crosses the 50% threshold. So now comparing the least to the most resentful, the probability that people are going to give this response is going up by 0.5. So really a lot. And it just doesn't make sense. What does that have to do with Irish, Italians, and Jews? It's just not the thing. But what Tesler argues is that the parties have been all over the place on race throughout their history. So of course, Lincoln was a Republican, and the Republicans got tons of African American support for years and years and years and years. And the Republicans got very little support in the South, because the South remembered them as the party of Lincoln and the Civil War. Then in 1964, the presidential campaign between Lyndon Johnson and Goldwater, you had a pretty distinct liberal, and Goldwater's, one of the big things about Goldwater's platform is that he was against the Civil Rights Act. And Goldwater lost in a landslide. But for the first time ever since the Civil War, the Republicans came much closer to winning the South than they had in the past. So this is the beginnings of what became known as the Southern strategy. And Democrats, who had been kind of wishy-washy on race, because Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats just had different preferences on it, the Democratic Party started to move in more of the pro-African American direction, and Republicans less so, under a certain way of understanding. So that had been going on for a long time. And that's probably part of what we're seeing in that 2007 stuff. But all of a sudden, so anyway, the last part, sorry, dogs are barking. Tesler's argument is that what happened here is that even though sophisticates, people who pay attention to politics, knew this about the parties, that the parties had somewhat taken sides on civil rights and equal treatment and whatnot. But a lot of people don't pay attention to politics, and just, if they have a party ID, it might be just because of what their family did or what their community's like, and they don't think about the substance that much. But then in 2008, you don't have to know anything about 1964 or Goldwater or anything to know that it's a black guy running against a white guy. So his argument is that it came down, basically lower levels of interest learned this about the party system. So it wasn't actually that much of a policy difference, but people that hadn't really realized it kind of got the memo at this point. That's his argument. And so you might say, well, healthcare, that was Obama's thing. So, some even called it Obamacare instead of the ACA. But Tesla shows this over and over and over. So it became an ingredient in vote choice in a way that it hadn't before. I don't know if you remember the TARP, the Troubled Assets Relief Program that George W. Bush created and Barack Obama continued. That became heavily associated with the racial resentment scale, where if you were racially resentful, you hated the TARP, and if you were less resentful, you kind of liked the TARP. Added towards Hillary Clinton, who is not, African American, but she was Obama's Secretary of State and was in the Democratic Party with him. Even, bizarrely enough, Portuguese water dogs. Does anybody remember Bo Obama, the Portuguese water dog? So he had promised Sasha and Malia that if he ran something like, if they let him run again, or if he won or something like that, they would get a dog. But somebody was allergic, so they needed to find a breed that was not a problem for allergic people. And they did all this research and found that Portuguese water dogs are hypoallergenic. They're kind of the labradoodles of their in that way. So anyway, so Tesla did an experiment where he showed everybody Bill Clinton's Labrador, and then he showed people pictures of a Portuguese water dog who happened to be Bo Obama, but he randomly assigned them to either be told this is Bo Obama or this is Splash Kennedy. Ted Kennedy also had a Portuguese water dog. So they're getting same breed, same party of owner, and it didn't actually move preferences around, but the racial resentment scale became associated with this thing because it was less influential in how people felt towards Splash, the dog, than Bo, the dog. Anyway, so this just review, you could probably already realized how this relates to social identity theory. The salient stuff, if all of a sudden people are thinking about it and they're responding to this outgroup, maybe the in-group has been activated. So again, Tesla kind of did the outgroup affection dimension, and we're testing the in-group. Does it matter? And we had previous work finding white identity, just not doing much. So we want to see if Obama changed things for that. Just in the interest of full disclosure, here's the items that we use to measure white identity. How close, we asked them about a bunch of groups, and one of them was whites. In terms of ideas and interest, how important is being white to your identity? They're kind of weird questions, but they measure what we're seeking to measure. So we had 3 different hypotheses, and I do want to talk about this just for a little bit. If you end up doing research, and especially when you're doing something with an experiment, you can be in a position where you have to get a certain result to be right. And that you should avoid that as much as you can. You want to, if at all possible, set up your research so that no matter how it comes out, we're going to learn something. And experiments are great and that they're very direct. They've got wonderful internal validity, but they can be cruel because they can just not work. And you can find that the thing that you thought was going to make a difference did not. And if then you've got nothing to say, that's a bummer. So we had 3 different thoughts of how this could turn out. So it could be, what we're going to do is we're going to look across a whole bunch of elections, and I'm only going to talk about presidential stuff. But as you saw in the paper, we also did Senate and House. So one would be the null. White idea didn't matter before, doesn't matter now. So whatever happened with racial resentment, the same thing did not happen. And that would be kind of surprising from a social identity point of view, but that's why you do research, is to see if you can be surprised. Another possibility, and there's some literature to support this, that the Democratic Party, the Tesla, Tesla's story may not be entirely right, that everybody already knew this about the parties. So you ask about white ID, and that's going to be less likely to support the Democratic Party. And that goes all the way back to 1965 when the parties started arraying in this way. Or the third possibility is that Tesla's story is happening on this other dimension, that it depends upon the candidate, that when Barack Obama's running, or it's a black candidate against a white candidate, this in-group stuff starts to matter more than it would otherwise. So however this comes out, we've got something to say, which was nice. That was a good aspect of this paper. So just a tiny bit of background. This is not super important, but just wanted you to know. So what we're seeing in all this is white respondents only. All the models, except for the ones in Massachusetts, have controls for racial resentment. And that's important because when you control for something, you've kind of taken its influence out. So if we see, as we do, white identity making a difference after we've controlled for racial resentment, then we're kind of validating that 2-dimension model. Because if racial resentment's just kind of the other side of in-group, out-group, then it would be doing all the work. And when we put in white ID, it wouldn't be significant. So the whole paper shows many tests across many data sets and types of elections, but I just want to draw again, and this is something that comes with experience and those signposts and stuff that we've talked about. You don't need to digest every single bit of every table. Can I move you up? So, statistical significance, the existence of these stars is what wins us the bet or says we didn't win the bet. So let's think about each of those 3 hypotheses. So if it's the null, then white identity should never have an asterisk, right? It didn't matter, or these little tiny effects, so that the regression coefficient is how much you go up in Y when you do a unit in X. So small numbers, and if that continued the whole way through, that would have been support for condition 1, the null. Or if this is just the post-1965 party system, then they should be significant all along. Because, Mondale was kind of the heir to Hubert Humphrey, who was the big civil rights guy, and Reagan was heir to, he was very friendly with Goldwater. So, it was all there. Now, the policy space was not that much difference. But again, that's not the pattern we see. What happened instead is, this one. Oh, all right. You know what we're going to do? We're just going to shrink it down. Just in 2008 and 2012, it's significant. And you might say, well, this is just racial resentment. You know, you're not actually adding anything besides Tesla. But the fact that we've got significant coefficients on racial resentment, and we're still getting significant coefficients on the white identity, says that they're doing different work. They're explaining different variants. Kyle, you got a question?
Yeah, so it was statistically significant in 2008 and 2012 for white identity, but in 1996 it wasn't. However, the numbers are the same. It says negative 0.16 and negative 0.16 in both years. So I'm
That's
just
a
wondering.
great. I'm so glad you noticed that. So there's two things here. You got your coefficient, and you're right to be looking at that. And then the thing below it is the standard error. And if you know about confidence intervals, the standard error decides how broad your confidence interval is. So what we're asking when we test for significant statistical significance is whether it could be that there's no effect. Is it plausible that a coefficient of 0 would fit the data that we have? And so the ratio there, here, this standard error is bigger than 0.16. 0.32 is more than 0.16. So we have a lot of uncertainty about what the true value is. 0.16 is our best guess, but the confidence interval on that is really broad. Here, the standard is 0.06. And the rule of thumb, so if you're familiar with stats, this all comes down to critical values, and 1.96 is the critical value, but we just use 2. So if the standard error is, if the coefficient's twice the standard error, it's statistically significant, and that pattern does go through. So something about this, so the trend, you're right, seems to be similar, but it's not as well organized. It's a much noisier relationship. So if you saw it as a scatter plot, the dots would be all over the place, although that cloud might have a tip to it. And on these, it's a pretty tightly organized cloud. They're all the points are closer to the estimated line. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
It's a great question.
Thank you.
You know, if you go on, people end up spending a lot of time thinking about standard errors, and it's really the both of them that are important. Actually, here I have I should have realized. So this is the same thing, but now we've put down the error bars around the coefficients. So what we care about is whether 0 is inside it. So yeah, you can see 1996, even its top plausible value is relatively low, and its lowest possible plausible value is kind of low, but it's so broad. So like here, the Dukakis versus George H.W. Bush, we have a better estimate. We have less uncertainty about what the role was, but it's closer to 0. It seems to be a small number. Here we have a fair amount of uncertainty, but even with that, the influence was so large that it's statistically significant. What's critical for this is whether this whisker is going across 0. So that's on vote choice. And like I said, we like to do things all different ways to demonstrate robustness. This is presidential approval, and it's the same pattern. So right, 2008, George W. Bush is still president, but then the 2010 and 2012 are approval of Barack Obama, and their higher levels of racial resentment are dragging down his approval. So, two pretty, I mean, so the Legos somebody can take away from this, and it's got cited some, and I'm pretty happy with it. So other people have cited it to support the two-dimensional model, which I'm happy with. It does seem that the candidate activation is part of what's going on, and I don't know, I haven't looked again at it, but I know that racial resentment seems to be a candidate effect also. So it continued to be influential in 2016. But it seems that, if you draw enough attention, that in-group processes also can affect political outcomes. So that's what we got out of that, although I find it a depressing paper. Okay, so final paper. And I know I'm hitting you with a lot, but I just want you to see how this, when we say theory, predicting many things, right? That one theory is supposed to generate many hypotheses. A few things about what social identity says is predicting things in different venues and different areas. So one more paper, new transition. Let's everybody take a deep cleansing breath. New topic. New author. Nick.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to stop everybody's hopes for a transition from this last paper. I know it's pretty depressing, but I was just wondering, I was looking at the data and like your explanation as for why the 2004 election was dropped. And I was kind of wondering, why did the it's the American National Elections Studies, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Why did they drop those? Do you have any insight as to why they dropped measures of identity in that survey?
So the American National Election Study happens every presidential election. It used to go every 2 years, so it also get off year elections. The short answer is it's working within a budget, and there's some things that we always ask about, like party ID, vote choice, likes, dislikes about the parties, the feeling thermometer, which I'm going to show you. But everything else, you're competing for space with other scholars. So somebody didn't make a good enough case for including the identity ones when they were making those decisions. I don't know why in particular. And you can see in 96 we didn't have racial resentment.
Right.
So yeah, it's one of the challenges when I talk about make sure data is there. Like if you want to do something about racial resentment, you want to make sure that you want to do something not about 1996 if you're going to use the ANES. And these are the kinds of things you want to figure out before the drop dead semester when you're actually doing it.
Right. And then just to go off of it, just
Sure.
one more little quick thing. When you were showing your you had another short sort of I always forget what we should call these. Basically where you were showing the why can't I think of it now? The presidential approval ratings based off of race, right?
Yeah.
And with this, I was wondering, another thing that I was thinking about is especially with that 2004 election, right? It was really that approval rating for Bush, or at least for W. Bush, must have been fairly high, and how that might have skewed the data because of, well, actually, it might not have been.
By 2008, he was down pretty low.
Yeah, right. By
Yeah.
2008, he was down low, but in that in between, I'm wondering what that would have kind of looked like with in regards to race and things like that.
Yeah, and here we do have this 2001 where Bill Clinton just barely is significant. Yeah, I have no particular thoughts about it. And, this is something that is kind of up to you as a reader, is how consistent do the patterns have to be. And everybody has different tastes. But the one thing you want to do is be consistent. So like,
and I'm wondering if security played a vital role in that presidential election, because remember, this was soon after 9/11, and even Vice President Cheney mentioned that if you vote for the opposition, then the terrorists win. And plus, there wasn't that racial resentment because of the opposition candidate. Yeah.
I don't know. It would be, yeah, but that's always a risk in survey research when you're not designing it yourself. Is that a question that you want might not be there? Excuse me.
All right, thank you.
All right, I'm very, very glad you asked about that. Great question so far. Anybody else want to ask about the depressing one or the first one before we go to the third one? Well, if you think of anything, let me know. So, you may have heard about political polarization in the United States. I think it's come up. So, and that is a whole fascinating literature in and of itself. Maybe if we have some extra space in the course, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But as people have looked at it systematically, they found something interesting. The public, what is polarization? It means people disagree with each other. It means people want either, they're out on the polls. They're either very much for or very much against stuff. So if you look at issues, policy positions, even stuff like abortion, if you just put on the x-axis all the various possibilities, from make it completely illegal always, make it available anytime, and then in the middle, the kind of intermediate positions, you don't have everybody off at the extremes in terms of what they want in the policy. It's much more of a kind of a bell curve. And taxes, lots of stuff. We just do not see policy preferences polarized. So it doesn't seem to be, and also as terms of people self-identify, they don't self-identify that much as extreme liberals. And so there are some more extreme conservatives, but not a ton. Even on that, it seems to be that the public is more moderate than Congress is, for sure. If you want to compare those on policies and ideology, Congress is, the elites are way more polarized than regular people are, which was a puzzle because we all feel like it is. So what we have settled on is this idea. I mean, what the evidence shows is that what we've got is affective polarization. So for a long, long time, we've asked this question that we call the feeling thermometer. And I've got the text of it up here. ANES is not the only one that asks this question, but it's probably the longest, asked it most often. So we asked this question for people in politics and for groups. I'd like to get your feelings towards some of our political leaders. I'm going to name something. If you feel warm towards that person or group, say a number between 50 and 100, 100 being very warm, 50 is kind of in between, and 0 is cold. Now this, people are polarized on. The proportion of people who say that, who put the out party at 0. So I mean, Republicans who say 0 about the Democratic Party, Democrats who say 0 for the Republican Party. That was really low until kind of the 80s, 90s, and it started going up, and now it's a fair chunk. So we do see that polarization where, interestingly, people don't love their in-party much more over the time series, but they hate the out party. The average thermometer rating of the out party has plummeted in the past 20, 30 years. So you can guess this is social identity. And boy, when I read this, I was so excited to see. So yeah, we talk about something citing somebody. So Lewandowski, I think we cited Transue 2007 in the other paper, but that's a little cheesy. This, though, this is a real citation. This is somebody who I've never met, still have never met him. And he's saying Transue used this, right? So this is the kind of connection we're interested in the paper. And it could have been Transue did this completely wrong, and I'm going to show you how it does. That's a fine way to establish that same kind of. So people cite each other for all kinds of reasons, cooperatively, competitively, and whatnot. So, and he's right in the same. So the common in-group identity model is kind of a subset within social identity theory. So he adopted the same theoretical framework, but now, as you can imagine, the groups are not blacks and whites, or this company, that company. They're going to do it with partisans. And you can see the connection. I mean, I was so thrilled, and I mean, I think this is an excellent paper, even if it had nothing to do with what I do. But it's really clean, it's experimental, and and he doesn't oversell what he's got. So, priming national identity will improve evaluations of the opposing party. Again, it's that I'm going to take them and bring them closer to me. So by priming this broader identity, they are less outgroup, and I'm thinking about more of the ways that they are in a shared in-group with me. So it doesn't affect what I think about my party. It's just that those former outsiders are a little more in. Totally. So this is the exact same theoretical framework. And he's listed two things. So evaluation of the opposing party. And then he says, and also for robustness for leaders, right? A couple of different things. The specific hypotheses are on page 3. You anticipated this. Same generic framework, but now we're putting in Democratic and Republican subgroups, and American national identity again as the superordinate. And so he's trying to do the same thing, the same kind of thing. He wants to draw attention either to the subgroups or to the American identity. Actually, his control, he just figured that he didn't specifically prime the parties the way I primed white identity. He just figured it's probably there. So, the awesome glory of random assignment to conditions. The thing about survey research is you finish it, and then somebody will say, well, what about this? This other thing might have mattered. Like Ali, not that I'm saying Ali is doing a what about, but he said there was this whole security stuff happening, and so you hope that you had national security items in the field, but sometimes you just don't, right? In a survey, you can only control for the things that you anticipated by measuring them, or any kind of data gathering thing. But when you use a true experimental design, this is the same as a randomized controlled trial. What you've done by randomly assigning everybody to two different groups is you've made those groups equivalent on even the stuff you don't know about, the unknown unknowns. And then when something happens to the treatment group, that's the only way they systematically differ. So then if they end up doing something different, it's because of the treatment. And are there people who are You know, whatever exception you want to say, you know, whatever other variable you want to introduce, that can be true, but by randomly assigning a large group of people to two different conditions, that's also present in the other. Well, what if people hate America, right? And the American identity thing pisses them off. Yes, that could happen, but there's about as many of those people in the control as there are in the treatment. So if the treatment actually pissed people off, we would learn that it pushed things down, if that's a lot of what's going on. So you get away from needing a random sample, which is nice also, but I have a whole thing and I'll stop ranting about it right now. I know I've been talking a lot, but do you remember? So I'm trying to give a little comprehension opportunity. How did he make American identity salient in his first experiment? Do you remember this? As you're thinking about it, I'll say, in a later experiment that I did during COVID, we were interested in American national identity and COVID compliance. We used Lewandowski's treatments and a couple of others that Greg Petra, my co-author on the other one, and it turned out that Lewandowski's, we did some manipulation checks to see whether it actually brought American identity up, and his were better than the ones that Greg came up with. So see, it's all, there's tons of cumulative. Anyway, do you remember this, or is it not worth digging for? Yes. What did I just do? So he had two things. He had them read a paragraph. So the control group, they just read something of equal length as what the treatment group read. The treatment group read some pro-America paragraphs, and then they were asked to write another paragraph about why they're proud to be an American. So, so yeah, he just went right to it. But there's that same, it's a different way of measuring it, but his, I think, is better. Like I said, I was kind of constrained and that I didn't want to ruin other people's, the respondent's mindset for other questions, but his was a custom experiment, so he could prime the heck about what he wanted to prime. So he had people spend some time just thinking about whether it's intake and out, about positive aspects of American identity for them. So I just want to highlight some things about this paper that I think are really good. The connection between theory and measurement is really good. Like he said, he wants to vary American identity, and the treatment he describes obviously does it. The dependent variable that he uses is the same one that's been in the literature. So he's right on, even though he's doing an experiment, he uses something that we've done in random sample surveys. So he's connected himself up with this, with other theories of affective polarization. And then he's got some non-obvious things. So he says it wouldn't expect USAD to affect in-party affect. Try saying that in front of a group many times. So affect is emotion here, and affect is causation. So, you know, one counter could be that it's not really American identity. It's just, you just put them in a positive mood, and what you're getting is a mood effect. So if it's a mood effect, it should drive up thermometers across the board. Everything is wonderful. But that's not the social identity prediction. So having these points where there's differences in predictions are really useful. And that, of course, is connected to the two-dimensional model. Okay. So I'm not sure why I put this up again, but it's the same set of hypotheses. And here's the first table that we get. So this is much simpler and than the table that I showed you in mine. And there's a lot of redundancy. There's repeated stuff in here. But again, the key is statistical significance. And here they've indicated statistical significance by putting it in bold. But you can also figure it out yourself by looking at that confidence interval in square brackets. If that's just like the whisker thing that I showed. So if that contains 0, then the true value might be 0. And if it doesn't contain 0, then we're pretty confident it's something for real. So, out party feeling thermometer. And the treatment, we have a positive 5.599. So that means that on average, people who did that American treatment and then were asked the feeling thermometer about a bunch of things, they were on average 5.6 points warmer, degrees warmer towards the out party than people in the control group. Then, 5 points on a feeling thermometer is not nothing. If that translates into vote choice, that'd be pretty darn good. And then same party and feeling thermometer. He predicted that this would not. And we've got a low, just 1.6. And also, even that, the standard error is quite high. So it didn't really push people around on that. So that's good for him because he made this distinguishing between just general happiness or good mood and specifically this idea of drawing previous enemies closer. Enemies is probably a bit strong. So then the Obama feeling thermometer, about the same. It's significant. So R means Republicans answering the feeling thermometer about Obama. Democrats answering the feeling thermometer about Obama. He's already their guy. So we didn't expect it and it doesn't happen. And then, and so on and so on. So I think not everything goes exactly like, I think negative traits is something he would have predicted the treatment to reduce, and it didn't significantly. And to tell you that when stuff looks too perfect, I get suspicious. So this doesn't, for me, I'm more of a general pattern person. I think our social science is very imprecise. So I don't expect everything to work out exactly the way it's expected. So this to me is pretty strong evidence. We're almost done with my part. So then he reports three, he calls them 3 experiments. This one's actually a natural experiment. So having people write that stuff, I mean, like I said, I love it that it's nicely connected to theory, but it's not very real world, right? And people don't have to just write paragraphs about how proud they feel about stuff in general. I mean, once in a while you might. So this one is a natural experiment where he had access to some survey data that was being collected week by week. They were re-asking or remeasuring some of the same items. And his independent variable here, so the dependent variable is the same. It's the feeling thermometer of the opposing party. But now the independent variable is whether you're close to the 4th of July. So, and how long is this window? And he says, I don't know. So let's look at a bunch. And you might think the farther we get away from the 4th of July, it might get weaker, right? So 14-day window is a week before, a week after. So relative to other windows, any other window in the data, any other 2-week period, people who were asked the feeling thermometer within 14 days of the 4th of July were 1.87 degrees warmer. So, and you look at one day, which is actually on the 4th of July, and you think, hey, Matt, what's going on? Shouldn't that be the best day? And he said in the text that they didn't get that many responses. They only got 86 responses that day. So although he's giving a larger, well, I guess that's comparing it to its other similar windows. So, and this, we don't have to spend that much more time with this, but doing both. So I've asked you to sort of, as you're doing your annotated bibliographies, think about what methods are being used and which ones are stronger or weaker. And every now and then you get these ones where they do both or several things all at once. And that's, to me, is very persuasive and very exciting. So experiments have really strong internal validity. And that means we know what's going on. We know it wasn't something else. Why? Because we have random assignment and because we control the treatment. So this is why it's so big in medicine, right? In medicine, people are going to get more healthy, less healthy. People are going to get better and worse on their own. We know that. And we can't figure out everything that's going to happen to somebody, but we can randomly assign people to one group or another, and then the treatment be some dose of some drug. And if they differ in the end, it has to be because of that drug, right? I mean, not 100%. There's always the possibility that randomization does something weird, but that's why randomized controlled trials will just obliterate a bunch of correlational studies. But for our purposes, we generally can't randomly assign politics. You know, we can't randomly assign people to be Republicans or Democrats. We can't randomly assign them to live in a G7 country or another one, right? So sometimes we can abstract over to an experiment that's relevant, but it's still kind of artificial. So we get really good insight on whether that thing, that variable, affects people. But we saw it happen in the lab or in this one survey experiment, but we don't know whether that's what happens to them in their day-to-day life, right? That's external validity, or the ability to generalize. And that's where surveys shine, because if you do get a random sample survey, you do get a pretty good estimate of what the entire American public thinks about something. I may be eliciting some poll skepticism about election results. You should just put that aside for a moment. And elections are very difficult to forecast, but there's just the general what goes with what. Surveys are great at. But like I said, you don't know exactly what the thing is. There's always these nagging questions like, what if it was something else? You know, could it be that there's a spurious thing that what you think is the cause is actually just standing in for something else? So they each have their strengths and weaknesses. And a mature, a robust literature will have people demonstrating the same theoretical predictions in several different data collections, some with strong internal validity, some with strong external validity. And that's when we start really believing stuff. So repeating it in different ways, these are things that should give you more confidence in a theory. All right.